It's very difficult when people talk about you to sit there and not say anything. But the 25th Prime Minister of Australia has endured people talking about him and talking about his character and things like that, and it's now his chance to respond. Would you please welcome Mr. Howard?
Well, thank you very much, Tom and Andrew Blythe, to my dear friend John Anderson and all my other former parliamentary colleagues. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank the Centre for staging this seminar, and I am very grateful for the announcement that was made at lunchtime today for the Centre for Public Leadership. I should report to you that a few weeks ago, Professor Frame and Andrew Blythe and I went out to the Whitlam Institute at the University of Western Sydney, and it was a very interesting experience, a very fine setup there, and I know that one of the things that will happen as the centre here evolves, there will be cooperation across the party divide, because the most valuable contribution, a retrospective analysis of the Howard government can do, is to also include in that retrospective a recognition that there are other views about the performance of that government, and understanding the perspective across the political divide is quite important. Now, I think in the limited time available, the most useful thing I can do is to say something of my recollection of the circumstances leading up to the election, what I felt at the time of the election, and how I reacted and some of the impulses that influenced me in the early months of the coalition government in 1996. And along the way, respond to some of the issues that have been raised by all of the contributions which I've greatly been interested by, I've appreciated, and all have been of a very high order. Context, as a famous man or woman, I don't know who, once said, is everything. And the context of the 1996 election was, as Paul Kelly and others have pointed out, a Liberal Party nervous about the prospect of ever again winning an election. And there were disappointments in 1987, there was intense disappointment in 1990, there was massive disappointment in 1993. And I had no idea that we were going to win with a majority of 45. I can remember polling day wandering around the polling booths in Bennelong, my own electorate, over and over and over in my mind, thinking of, well, we'll surely win Eden Monaro, and we'll surely win such and such a seat, and we'll just win enough seats in New South Wales and Queensland to get across the line. And of course, famously, when we were at the Intercontinental Hotel, and amongst others in my room, there was Graham Morris, and we had the people from the Electoral Commission there, and we got a figure in. The first figure, I think, was from a booth in Portland, in the electorate of Macquarie in rural New South Wales, and it showed a 16% swing to the coalition. And I said, this is terrific, and Graham Morris said, hang on, Tiger, there's only 80 votes at that polling booth. But of course, time went on, and it proved to be so. I think that's very important. Now, the attitude that I brought to government as far as policy and philosophy was concerned, I think Paul Kelly put it well when he said it was a combination of commitment to market economics, fiscal responsibility, coupled with cultural traditionalism. And that's a fair description. And I think you could actually explain almost every single thing that my government did within the framework of it. One of the things that greatly aided the government and aided the coalition in the lead up to the election, and as we worked our way through the years of government, was that the personnel issues had been resolved and were in good order. Personnel issues can disrupt a government very early on. It was a breakdown in relation to personnel issues that led to Kevin Rudd's removal, and there's no doubt it was what led in part to Tony Abbott's removal. Now, it remains a matter of historical fact that the other occasions in which an incumbent Prime Minister has been removed, certainly since the World War II, have been when that person has been at least afforded the opportunity of winning an election after becoming Prime Minister, in the case of John Gorton, and in the case of Bob Hawke having won 4 elections, and the circumstances there were entirely different. So lesson number 1 for any incoming government is unresolved personnel issues can cause enormous damage. I was greatly aided by the remarkable compact that had been reached within the Liberal Party between Peter Costello, Alexander Downer and myself, the understanding to which reference was made, I think, by Paul again. And in this respect, one in my position, and I think the Liberal Party's position, can't pay enough credit to Alexander Downer for the extraordinarily gracious way in which he accepted the need for a change and the fact that I was able to be effectively drafted as leader of the Liberal Party in January of 1995. I think that was of enormous help. And it is true, as a number of speakers have said today, that the party came together. There was a steely resolution not to repeat the errors of the past, and so many people made a contribution to that. And when people are kind enough to draw attention to the fact that I was the second longest serving Prime Minister so far in Australia's history, I ought to point out that Peter Costello is the longest serving Treasurer in Australian history, and Alexander Downer is the longest serving Foreign Minister in Australian history. And it's quite extraordinary that the same 3 people should occupy those positions. The other personnel issue that was well and truly settled, of course, was the historically warm relationship between the Liberal Party and the National Party. I've had my share of encounters with sections of the National Party, particularly in 1987. But the truth is that the history of relations between the National Party and the Liberal Party, when the leaders of those parties come out of New South Wales, where the level of cooperation has always been much greater, it's been quite different. And I have to say that the contribution made to the stability of the government by both the philosophical convergence between the 2 parties on economic issues and also the implied covenant between the 2 parties that, yes, the National Party would go along with issues where there was overwhelming national support for a particular direction, but there had to be an acceptance. There were special issues of significance to regional Australia where the will, if you like to put it that way, of the National Party should be respected. Now, I had that understanding with Tim Fischer, I had that understanding with John Anderson, and I had that understanding with Mark Vaile. And what should never be forgotten in looking at the success of the Howard government was that the attitude of the National Party leadership on core economic issues was essentially indistinguishable from the attitude of the leadership of the Liberal Party. When it came to things like fiscal repair, industrial relations reform, which were fundamental issues to our reform agenda, there was no difference between the attitude of John Anderson, Peter Reith, Peter Costello, Alexander Downer, Tim Fischer and myself. And I think that represented quite a high watermark, if you like, in the long history of the relationship between the 2 parties. Paul Kelly identified the 2 strands in my approach to government as far as belief and values is concerned, and I'm very grateful that Kevin Andrews drew on that quote from the acceptance press conference of mine in January of 1995, because I did bring together in that particular couple of sentences the fundamental indicia of how we were going to govern. David Kemp was right to draw attention to the continuity between the forgotten people and the Howard battlers. And it was also the case, I think Andrew Robb it was who referred to fight back. It was also the case that when you've been in politics for a while and you have developed an attitude and you've developed a set of policies, you always go back to your fundamental beliefs when you get the opportunity of executing change. And I was very conscious as Prime Minister that on occasions, many of the things we did, as Andrew referred to, were to be found in fight back, but I would say the same about future directions. I think future directions in a philosophical sense was even more compelling as far as the approach that we adopted. I think it's true that we had learnt from bitter experience. 1993 was very instructive. What was very instructive to me about 1993 was our health policy. I have long held the belief, I expressed it at the time, that our health policy did more damage to us than the GST in 1993. I've never forgotten those devastating Labor Party ads showing a young pregnant woman complaining about the scalpel being taken to Medicare, and the advertisement was complete with the scalpel. And so I think it's very important to remember that we had been through the school of hard knocks. We lost all of these elections. Of course, there's always unexpected events that come along. When I was sworn in as Prime Minister, I had no idea that Port Arthur was around the corner. I was sworn in on the 11th of March. Port Arthur occurred on the 28th of April. I had no idea that we would have to encounter an enormous national security challenge and the challenge of the East Timor intervention, and indeed the genesis of the fact that I decided to accept the offer of the University of New South Wales to deposit my papers at the Advocate Council is to be found in the fact that in the time that I was Prime Minister, the tempo of this nation's military involvement rose enormously and stayed at that very high level. I think it's legitimate to reflect upon missed opportunities and mistakes, as well as the achievements of that first year of government. I make no particular comment on the examples of mistakes that have been offered, except to make one reference to the issue that Gary Johns raised, and that is, and I know it will be dealt with further down the track in later sessions, but that is the issue of middle class welfare, particularly family benefits. One of the fundamentals that I brought to the 1996 election campaign was a determination to do something to lighten the taxation burden on families with dependent children. I happen to believe that the most important thing we do is to rear the next generation, and it follows from that that a tax system that doesn't recognise it is a tax system without any social vision. Let me put it even more succinctly. A couple on $80,000 a year living in house number one is not entitled, in my view, to have, well, let me put it another way, family on $80,000 a year with two children living in house number one oughtn't to have the same tax burden with a couple living next door at the same level of income. Now, however you decide to do that, through a combination of tax relief or family benefits or whatever, is in a sense a matter of detail. But as a matter of philosophy, I do think the tax system has to recognise the cost of raising children, and if it doesn't, it is deficient in fundamental social terms. Now, that was the genesis of what I wanted to do in that area. It started off as increases in the tax-free threshold, and then because some people are outside the tax net, you offer the alternative of direct payments, and then of course the Labor Party in government carried that to its extreme where you could no longer claim the family tax benefit off your taxation return at the end of the year. But that is getting into the weeds, getting into the detail. And you can argue about the volume of that assistance, but that's the philosophy behind it. And the other thing I would say about it is that the the benefit system, which essentially emerged from our time in government, and it has been changed significantly by both the Labor governments and by the current coalition government, has nonetheless been analysed as the most efficient amongst OECD countries and as having less churn. That's the practice of raising something by taxation and then giving some of it back through a direct payment, less churn than in any other OECD countries, and it runs at about 70% of the average cost of a similar system. So in other words, on levels of efficiency and equity, it is regarded as a far more efficient tax transfer system than just about any other country. Mistakes, let me say, I think towards the end of the year, in 1996, which had been a fairly dramatically successful year, the government was disconcerted by the WIC decision handed out by the High Court of Australia. Now, remember, that was a decision which rather unexpectedly dispensed with the notion that had been common across the political divide that the grant of a pastoral lease extinguished native title. Now, that in fact was a recital in the Native Title Act enacted by the Keating government. That began a process whereby it looked as though the government could not make up its mind. I'm not, of course, condemning the High Court decision. I didn't like it, I didn't agree with it, but I didn't presume to condemn it. It was the decision of the High Court, and we were all bound by it, as we should be. But as a result of that, I think the government, through into 1997, took too long to formulate its response. And we had months of apparent consultation and indecision and nightly reports on the television to the effect that this or that pastoral or mining group was saying they weren't going to accept anything, and then I produced the 10-point plan, and so you will probably remember that there was a period, and I think that of drift, and I think that particular decision began a process which did the government considerable damage. Can I just say a couple of other random things that are important? Firstly, the Senate. It's fair to say that I had an easier challenge from the Senate than either Tony Abbott or Malcolm Turnbull. And the major reason for that is that the principal crossbench party when I became Prime Minister were the Australian Democrats. And although the Australian Democrats were closer to Labor than they were to us, if Labor's here and we're here, Australian Democrats are here, whereas the Australian Greens are over there. And that makes an enormous difference. And both Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull have had to contend with that. Peter Reith was able to negotiate the Workplace Relations Act of 1996 with Cheryl Curnow, and whilst we never got out of the Australian Democrats a sensible attitude on unfair dismissals, we did get workplace contracts and a lot of other big changes that Warwick McKibben pointed out this morning were so important to economic change and economic growth. The other point I'd make about the Senate is that it was a quite remarkable experience dealing with Brian Harradine. Brian Harradine was the epitome of an ethical crossbencher, in my view. I always admired his principle. He made it very clear to me from the get-go that he respected the mandate we'd received, and there was no way he was going to try and frustrate the government. But you had to understand, Prime Minister, he didn't use these words, but this is in fact what he was saying. I'm still an old-fashioned Labor man at heart, and there are certain things that I see in the social justice context, and certainly that includes industrial relations, where you needn't imagine that I'm going to be supporting what you might want to do. And in the process, of course, he put in his oar for his state of Tasmania, which was perfectly legitimate. But I found him very pleasing to deal with. He was totally reliable and trustworthy and ethical. So history ought to record that we had a lot of challenges with the Senate, but I think both Abbott and Turnbull have had a much more difficult task with the Senate. There were two things that perhaps have only just been glancingly referred to today, which I was particularly proud of what we were able to do, and Brian Harradine played a role in one of these in 1996, and one of those was the new schools policy. The policy that we inherited in relation to independent schools was broadly described, as I recall it when we were elected in 1996, was that if a group of people wanted to start a new school in an area, and that area were already serviced by a government school or a Catholic school, and that included, by definition, self-evidently, most areas, you could start the new school, but you wouldn't get any federal help. And I remember before the 1995 election, I received a delegation from the then Anglican Archbishop of Sydney, Harry Goodhue, and several other people. They said, well, look, we're not against government schools or Catholic schools, don't get us wrong, but if another group wants to start a school, we can't do it, and will you change the new schools policy? And I thought that was only fair and reasonable. I said, I'll take it to my party, and they agreed, and we were able to get that legislation through, and I think it sort of broadened the choices, particularly in the outer suburbs of the large cities. And the other thing that was very, very important to me was we ring-fenced defence spending from any budget cuts. We made it very clear there would be no cut, and I was particularly proud that we did that, and of course as the years went by, the wisdom of that was demonstrated to have been most important. It is the case that, as Paul Kelly, once again drawing on his contribution, said, it is the case that the success of a government is never inevitable. It's easy to look back on a time a government's been in power 10, 20 years ago and say, and because they were in power for a long time, say, oh, well, it was always going to happen. That's not right. I thought, despite the enormous majority we have, when I got the exit poll from Linton Crosby, the 20 to 7, and the late arrival of that exit poll, 20 to 7 is suspicious, isn't it? The polling booths have closed at 6 o'clock and you get the exit poll at 20 to 7. No criticism of Sir Linton, but you think, gee, can't be too good. And it wasn't good. It was 53 to 47. But miraculously, we held on. And I do want, in the context of other remarks today, pay particular tribute to those three girls in South Australia, Christine Gallus, Trish Draper and Trish Worth, who hung on to the three marginal seats of Hindmarsh and Hindmarsh, Macon and Adelaide. It was quite, there were other remarkable performances as well. But you wouldn't have thought that were remotely possible at the end of 1996 that we could go so close, although we ended up with a margin of some 12 seats. But I was reminded that there is no inevitability about a long period in government by the way in which I delved back into the history of the Menzies government when I wrote the book about the Menzies era. In the first 5 years of Menzies government, he was by no means entrenched for a period of 16 years. His margin in 1954 was not all that great. He lost seats, and if it hadn't been for the catastrophic split in the Labor Party, catastrophic for the Labor Party that is, in 1955, he would certainly have lost office in 1961, because even without that split, he only held on by a margin of 2 seats. So there is nothing inevitable about long periods of government. And whilst on the one hand this may sound contradictory, you've got to maintain a continuity to deliver confidence and certainty over a period of time. Counterintuitively, you've got to reinvent yourself within the confines of that continuity. I know that's a convoluted way of explaining it, but I think I convey my meaning. I well remember having dinner at the Lodge in 1997 with a group of backbenchers who had, all of whom had won seats in 1996. They were the class of 96, and you have a very emotional attachment to a group of people that have come in with you when you first go into government. And they were talking about the upcoming election and said, well, we've done this and done that, let's sort of, just keep everything calm for the next 18 months. And I said, well, we won't be able to run the same campaign in 1998 or 1999 as we ran in 1996. We won't be running against an opposition, a Prime Minister who'd become unpopular, particularly in areas outside of Sydney, and we'll be running an entirely different campaign, and we'll have entirely different issues. And I think it's important always to keep that in mind, that the political climate can change very rapidly. And as Ian McAllister pointed out with his presentation, there was a very big change between 1996 and 1998. And then, of course, there was a significant recovery in 2001, and I think it was the potential for that significant recovery in 2001 which induced the Labor Party, after the 1998 election, to imagine that they were only one election away from victory, and that they could coast into power off the back of hostility to the GST. Let me finish by just saying again how important to my government's success, particularly at the beginning, was the way in which we went into government with all of the personnel issues at ease. There were no personnel issues. It was a very united team. And at the top of the government, we had a leadership of the two coalition parties that were simpatico on the principal economic issues, always a common view on national security issues, and a group of people at the top of the two parties who thought the same about the main issues. We had plenty of differences on detail, but we thought the same about big issues, and having been in opposition for 13 years, we weren't going to lightly muck up the opportunity we'd been given.